All right. So we are going to start with Andre Blaze. Are you ready?
Absolutely.
I thought you were not going to take off your glasses. That's fine. That's cool. All right. So how are you doing, Andre?
Not bad at all. Thank you.
All right. So of course we know that you've been on radio. You've been a host of different shows, different things. So I mean, just tell us a little bit about yourself, and then let's just get right into it.
So I'm Andre Blaze Henshaw. I'm told I have to add a Henshaw these days. I'm Andre Blaze Henshaw. I've done some print broadcasting about 5 million years ago. I did some radio broadcasting about 10 million years ago. And I've been on television since 2008, I think. I've also done a little bit of work in the diplomatic sector, and I'm a staunch podcast aficionado.
Wow.
That about covers it.
Okay.
He forgot to add that he had a lot of dreads back in 2008.
You have dreads?
There's no proof of that.
Shall I pull up the photo?
Dude, this is not Instagram.
Okay, so let's talk to you, Osagie. Just a brief introduction, let people get to know you a bit.
My name is Osagie Alonge. I am the editor-in-chief at Pulse Nigeria. I've worked at Pulse for 2 years and 4 months. Before joining Pulse, I worked at Nigerian Entertainment Today, where I honed my skills as a journalist. Before that, I was blogging, and before that, I was rapping.
So where's your single, man?
I know, right?
Where's the single?
FYI, none of those songs are on the internet, so it's fine.
So you can't even drop like small bars for us?
You can't critique everybody and not rap at least one line.
It's fine, no.
Just small, so that they can abuse you tomorrow.
I'll be boss.
Don't try it. 1 2 1 2. Oh yeah, now. Wow, that's too poor. Later now, you open your mouth on facts only and be discussing stuff. All right, let's move on to Princess. Just a little bit about yourself before we start. Let's get to know you better.
All right, my story is not as exciting as Osagie and Andre's one, but my name is Princess Abumere. I'm the Deputy Editor-in-Chief at Pulse.ng. I love storytelling, and yeah, that's about it. My life practically circles around news and stories, yeah.
All right, so what we're going to do now is we're going to start with Osagie. Just, give us a brief introduction into podcasts and all of that. And I'm timing you. You have
Fantastic. I'll start. So, Paul stumbled on podcasting last year, but before that, I've been a big fan of podcasts since 2008, 2009. I used to work at the Cyber Cafe. In fact, I ran the Cyber Cafe. My salary was 10,000 naira a month. Spend like 5,000 on transport, but it's fine. But I had access to internet, and that's the best thing you can ever have. Access to free internet, right? And from there, I discovered blogging. I also discovered podcasts. I had downloaded iTunes Player, and it had this section called podcast, and I was interested to see what it was, and I clicked on it, and it was something different. And I just kept downloading and downloading till my hard disk was filled up. But that's how I stumbled on it. I've been a very big fan of Andre Blaze, and when he started My Africa podcast in 2014, the power of storytelling and his interview skills were just incredible, and I got stuck to it. And deep down in my mind, I just always wished I would start my own podcast. So here you have it. Pulse has, we are leading in terms of producing the number of podcasts and numbers of views or downloads we have. So I put together this presentation, or we put together this presentation to show you guys. Everybody, I won't say everybody, let me take that back. Pulse Nigeria is a 24/7 digital media platform. We serve news to a wide audience, mass audience, and we are mobile first. In terms of owning podcasts, we have 6 podcasts. My Africa, which Pulse eventually bought and still has Andre as our employee.
It's rude to flip the finger that I want to flip at you right now, but okay.
All right, you have Loose Talk, which started last year. Who listens to Loose Talk? Oh, wow. There's Purple Hair Chronicles, It's new. It's erotica. You guys should try it out. Anybody who's into erotica is very interesting. It's about a girl who sleeps around, but it's very interesting. There's Republic of Bands. It's a society and culture podcast where you have our communities desk. It's an in-house podcast where you have our communities desk just discuss about things that happened over the week or the month. There's The Sound, which is a music podcast, talks about new music, what's reigning, what's trendy in the music sphere. And Halftime, as you can see, the football is a football podcast. 15 minutes, straight to the point. So let's talk about numbers. Podcast listening grew 23% between 2015 and 2016 across the world. 21% in the US, ages 12 and up, have listened to a podcast in a month, in the past month. Over 57 million people, right? Global audience, podcast audience, is constantly growing. It's over 57 million people. And 75% of monthly podcast listenership increased since 2013. The numbers are going up, and if you're in the tech space, if you work in the tech space, which is everybody's life nowadays, because everybody here has a smartphone, everybody is a techie to an extent, you would want to jump on the podcast trend in one way, either producing, listening, learning, being entertained. 64% of podcasts are being listened to on a smartphone or tablet. And 65% of weekly podcast listeners consume 5 shows or fewer. This will interest podcast producers to know that if 69% are listening to 5 shows every week, you probably want to produce your podcast weekly to be part of that community and not get left out. Thank you. So what is podcasting? We've heard the word podcasting. It is essentially a free service that allows internet users to pull audio files, typically MP3s, from a podcasting website to listen to on their computers or personal digital audio players. So, who listens to podcasts on iTunes? Who listens to podcasts on SoundCloud? Do we have more SoundCloud than iTunes, guys? I'm guessing the SoundCloud guys are Android users, and the iTunes guys, well, obviously, iPhones. The term comes from a combination of the word iPod, that is a personal digital audio player made by Apple, and broadcasting. Even though the term is derived from the iPod, you don't need an iPod to listen to a podcast. You obviously know that by now. iPods are extinct. Everybody uses their mobile phones. And you can use virtually any media, portable media player or your computer. Who uses their computer to listen to podcasts? But who uses mobile phones? Do we have mobile? So we have more mobile phones. Next, please. All right, so these 2 boring-looking guys came up with podcasts. David Weiner and Andy Corey. Andy Corey is a systems engineer. David Weiner is his close friend. And one came up with the technology to pull internet radio into his iPod. And that's how podcasts literally started. So he kind of worked the system and got a way to feed internet radio, which was a big thing in the mid-2000s in the US, to feed directly into his iPod because he was tired of listening to the songs or probably blind music. So coincidentally, he created this monster called podcast. Now, iTunes or Apple were very smart to understand that if this was a trend, they should quickly jump on it, which is what they do anyways. And they created their version and hosted it on the iTunes platform. And literally, that is how podcasting began. How to start a podcast? I know a lot of people have asked me these questions. I co-host a podcast. I have discussions. I meet people. They're like, how do I start my own podcast? I really want to start. I really have these stories to tell, or I want to interview people. I think my friends will like it. How do I start my podcast? This is why we're here. It's a masterclass, and it's for us to learn. Next slide. So the first thing you need to ask yourself is, why start a podcast? And with asking that question, you have to ask other questions. The first is, what will be the subject matter and or ongoing theme you will focus on? Is it a sports podcast? Is it a podcast about lifestyle? Is it a podcast about interviewing people with interesting stories? Is it a podcast about comedy? Is it a podcast about movies? Is it a podcast about film? Is it a podcast about music? Literally anything you want to think about. And there's literally a podcast for everything. There's a podcast for who listens to Guys We Effed, the two girls. You listen to it, bad guy. Yeah, bad guy. You know, there's literally podcasts about anything, from science to technology to pop culture to art, everything. So you need to ask, why do I want to start this podcast, and what will be the essence of the podcast? All right, second thing, go back. Thank you. How many and what segments will the podcast include? Andre, how many segments does your podcast have?
Well, you want to have your connecting part, so that's the intro, which defines what the podcast content is going to be. You want to have the body, which is essentially the main message of the podcast, and then you want to have your call to action at the end of it / your outro. So your call to action is how people come back and engage with you afterwards. So primarily 3 main parts.
Thank you, Andre. That's why we look up to you. All right, then another question you need to ask is, how will you transition from one segment to the next? It can't be rough. It can't be, you have to have a flow. It has to be fluid. Remember, you're not doing the podcast for yourself. Even though you want to connect with people, you want to put it out there for people to download or stream and listen. So how do you transition from one point to the other? Make it so fluid that it looks as if it's not segmented. It's very important. And how long would your podcast be, and how frequently will it be published? So, like the podcast I showed you guys, My Africa podcast is published weekly. Loose Talk is published weekly. I think all our podcasts are published weekly. Oh, Purple Hair Chronicles is published every 3 weeks. And you have people who release podcasts every day. So NPR has a podcast that they release every day. The BBC has a podcast they release every day. So it depends. You need to get the flow. But what is very important to build a cult following for podcasting for your listeners is that it has to be very rhythmic. So if you are publishing weekly, let it be weekly. If it's coming out on a Thursday, let it come out on a Thursday. If it's going to come out on a Monday, let it come out on a Monday. I remember one time we had issues with publishing one of the Loose Talk podcasts, and people cussed us out on Twitter, saying they will not drive to work. One guy said he's not going to work until he listens to it because he needs to drive to work to listen to it. I don't know if he lost his job, it's not my own business. But anyways, you need to have a rhythm, and people need to understand it. There's a reason why you love your favorite shows. I'm talking to the guys who watch cable TV and not go and download illegally on the internet. And even you guys who download illegally on the internet, there's always a specific period it gets uploaded. Tunde. It has a specific period it gets uploaded, so you always need to download it. So if you don't have that rhythmic progression, you're probably going to forget about it, because every time you go there, you're sometimes or most times disappointed that it's not there. So it's very important. Next slide. Then we're back on this because I need to explain to you, you need to understand what type of podcast will I have. Is it going to be a solo podcast? An example of a solo podcast is Purple Hair Chronicles. She's narrating everything. So she goes to London, she takes the train, she meets a guy, she goes home, she thinks she and the guy are going to, have a good time. They end up not having a good time. She goes back home, she's disappointed, she meets another person, blah, blah, blah. She's narrating it, and it's a solo podcast. You could have, a one-on-one podcast, which is what Andre Blaze does with My Africa. He sits down with one person and interviews the person. The person tells fantastic stories. They put it together and they publish, which makes up, the My Africa podcast. You could have a podcast so Halftime is very similar to My Africa. Steve Dede, our sports senior correspondent, meets with another person in the office.
Make it out of here.
I will. They are frustrated, don't worry. So Republic of Bands has about 5 people on it, and they find a way to connect and discuss without interrupting each other. Very important, I've not mentioned, is that you have to script your podcast. You can't just go in there and say, oh, I will just talk about, what this and talk about that. When you get into the flow, most especially when it's not a solo podcast and you have somebody, you kind of lose or, go off the track because you've forgotten what you want to ask, and the person has, individual stories. So you always have to script or have talking points. Princess is producer of Loose Talk, and she sends us talking points on Friday. At times it's late, but I'm managing.
Sorry.
It's fine. And so Loose Talk, 3 people, might have a guest, so maximum of 4 people. We've never had 5 people, and we understand. Also kind of builds a character around what you are producing, so people, kind of enjoy it and know what to expect. So it's not like you see 7 people, they are rowdy, or you have 5 people today or 3 people. Let it have some sort of character. Next. All right, so how to record your podcast? That's the most important thing, because you have all these ideas. How are you going to put it together? People ask me, how do I record my podcast? Do I need to be in like a big high-tech studio? I don't have money. How will I start? I'm going to give you different examples. The first example, which is the most professional example, is being in a studio. Who knows these guys? The Brilliant Idiots. So that's Andrew Schultz and that's Charlemagne the God from Power 105. They have an interesting podcast called The Brilliant Idiots. Weekly unique listens around 173,000. And they've been able to monetize podcasts because they are on the podcast network. We'll talk about that later. Can you go back? All right, so they're in the studio. They don't need to worry about anything. All they need to do is go there, set up the mic, record. They are not touching anything. There's a sound engineer who's going to take the vocals, mix the vocals, produce it, and give them an MP3 file, which they will upload, right? Next. So you could do this, which is kind of cost effective in this market, right? Where you're going to get a studio. You know how much, any artist in the house? No music.
Wow.
Come now, there should be one.
Shocking.
In Lagos, really?
Toby, no, you're a photographer. Yeah, so he's an artist in the building. He knows how difficult it might be going to a studio. How much is a studio session now? Yes. 15K. So if you're going to record, have a session, how long is a session? So 8 hours. And your podcast is, say, a bit over 1 hour. You can start, say, 15,000, 8 hours. I can do 8 episodes in 15 hours. Let me start. In your 6th or 7th month, you will be thinking, do I really need to do that podcast? The number safe. I just get as if I not do. So it's kind of tiring, and there are ways to cut these things. Like I said, the internet is so powerful, and there are so many hacks. This is something you can do. You can buy your own microphone with a little sound card. So you see there's a sound card at the bottom there. There's your microphone. You connect it to your laptop. You can be at home and record your podcast. Simple as that. You can take that mic and put it between 2 people if you have one person to interview and record. There are other hacks. You could have like a lapel mic that you can buy and connect to your laptop. And you can record at home and mix and export your files yourself. Trust me, I've done it before. People can do it, people do it, and they are not whiz kids. Okay, so it's that easy. You need to just download a software application. It could be Sonar, whatever, any Acid Pro. They are free on the internet. You could download and use them and have your own podcast. Next slide. And of course, very simple, you can actually use a smartphone. You can literally put your phone down, click record, and start recording, and when you're done, press end and upload your file. It's that simple. My wife has a podcast called Our Pink Dots. She records with her 2 best friends. They record at home every day. They just close the windows, put on a Samsung mobile phone, and they record and they put it up. So you can start. That's Elliot Wilson from Rap Radar and his wife, Danielle Smith, who works at ESPN. They have a podcast called Relationship Goals, and they record with their phone at home, in their kitchen. It is that simple, guys. There's no big thing about it. Next. So when you're done recording your podcast, you have to host your podcast, right? You have to put it somewhere for people to listen to or download. The 3 popular places to host your podcast are Libsyn, which connects to iTunes, which you can take the RSS feed. The idea is to, before you go to iTunes, you can't upload anything directly to iTunes. So if you're uploading music, you can't upload music directly to iTunes. You have to upload to a music aggregator like TuneCore or CD Baby. Same thing for podcasts. You need to upload to a server which will give you an RSS feed, which you submit to iTunes or your website. So Libsyn is a very interesting service you can use. You could also use WordPress. But for me and my family, we use SoundCloud. And I'll tell you why. SoundCloud is easy to upload. ID3 tagging, putting everything up is quite nice. And I'll tell you why. You could upload on SoundCloud, take the RSS and submit to iTunes, which is free, uploading on iTunes. and also have the file hosted on SoundCloud. So the guys in there, I asked, do you listen to the Loose Talk on iTunes or SoundCloud? They said they listen on SoundCloud. So not only am I hosting on SoundCloud for people to listen to, which is a popular audio sharing and streaming platform, they can also listen on iTunes. So I'm kind of beating the system here. Unlike Libsyn and WordPress, not too popular for listening to music files. Next. And when you're done uploading and hosting your files, you can distribute on popular platforms like iTunes. So I did a screenshot, and there you have Loose Talk, and you have Brilliant Idiots. Mommy, I'm famous. And you could put it up on SoundCloud, which is, really popular on mobile and on desktop, and also Stitcher, Radio on Demand, which is quite interesting. Next. Measurement and monetization, very, very important. You need to be able to track who is listening to your podcast, where they are listening from, and typically their demography. You need to understand this. Why? Because you would always give your brand or your agencies, if you're approached to monetize, you need to be able to tell people, or you even need to be able to know, and this is for any business, any platform, any web platform. You need to understand the kind of people that are coming or are listening to your podcast to be able to monetize it, to be able to even pattern the content you create. So imagine if we're creating, we have Purple Hair Chronicles, which is erotica, and we checked the statistics and we saw it was people below 15 listening to it. We'll be worried now that people below 15 are listening to erotica podcast in Nigeria. It's troubling. But other than that, you always need to measure how many people are listening. I think our biggest episode on Loose Talk was when we featured Ikechukwu. Was very interesting, and the last 5 minutes he talked about another rapper with another girlfriend that somebody collected from somebody, and it kind of went viral because it was distributed. So we were able to track and say, oh wow, anytime we have like a popular person, we have more numbers. There are more guys that listen to podcasts, or there are more girls that listen to the podcast. The biggest region they listen to. For us, it was amazing because we were able to find out that people were listening to the podcast from Russia, from Cyprus, from Australia. There's a guy listening from Trinidad and Tobago, King Titi. Interesting places, and we've been able to pattern the content to appeal to all those guys. You could also use for iTunes. So iTunes they don't give their statistics, but you can use PodTrack by taking the RSS you took from wherever you took it from, maybe SoundCloud or Libsyn, and attaching it there, and it can actually help you track how many people streamed and downloaded your podcast, plus unique downloads as well. In terms of monetization, it's really big in advanced countries, so the US, the UK, podcasts are really popping off. It's growing here. For Pulse, we've had people who have approached us to monetize. Our director of sales is here. Tunde, can you, please, you need to bring in the money. Thank you. Okay. All right, so we are in talks with monetizing, but the best thing for you to do is start now. Start when the conversation is, we are still in the early stage of these conversations, and you can start now, produce something, create something so potent that you have a cult following, and that in a year's time or 2 years' time, everybody is listening to your podcast, and you have power. You have the power. We've taken the power from the gatekeepers. We've taken the power from Novex, the radio station. We've kind of taken the power there where we can have these discussions without regularities, without regulation, and people can listen at whatever time. So it's best for you to start now. Let's start now. Create that community of podcasting. Start up a network. When you have one podcast, have two podcasts. We have 6 podcasts. It's easier for us to monetize because we can take all these numbers and sell it. Thank you very much. Next slide, please. All right, Donald Trump says, podcasts are great. Believe Pulse NG. Never said our president. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Osagie. Now we're going to ask Andre a couple of questions. Now we know that you've worked in radio. Obviously, you do podcasts. As Osagie has said, you're an employee of Pulse. Just stating that.
And I'm not happy with my benefits at all.
Oh, okay. Well,
ratting it out. Yeah.
And of course, we know you've done television as well. So, what do you think has led to the emergence of podcasts?
I think there are 3 main factors that have brought podcasts to the fore. in this century. So before we start talking about podcasts, you have to look backwards over your shoulder and see where we've come from. Do I have to get up for this? Is it okay if I sit or do I have to stand?
Sure, anything.
Okay, cool. Because since I don't have a presentation and everything. Right, so the three things that I think are responsible for the growth of podcasts in the fairly recent past are technology, first and foremost. We've come full circle to the point where your cell phone has more computing power than a Windows system from 1998 does, yes? Remember when you had flash drives that were, 256 MB?
Yeah.
And those things used to cost what, like 25 grand? Don't you feel like going back to smack those guys now? Yeah, because your average cell phone has 3 gig RAM, which makes it just about as powerful as a computer from the early 2000s. And you can go as high as 128 gig in a single flash drive, a single memory stick, right? So, technology has given you the ability to save the content. There was a time when CDs were the big rage, and before that, a time when cassettes were the big rage. The real reason why memory has always been a huge selling factor for technology has been the fact that people try to hold on to the things that hold relevance for them. Now, podcasts are huge today because your cell phone can keep Lord knows how many podcasts. So, 1, technology has aided with that. 2, the need to connect. Now, I love talking about numbers, and I believe that podcasts are going to take over the world one day. It's inevitable. Again, sorry, Dami. But the truth is, we are at a place in podcast history where we need to either connect or die. And it's very simple. Most people who listen to podcasts are looking for the niches. Let me tell you a very simple thing. Once upon a time, a long time ago, I used to be a very frequent host for events. So I'd get called up in the middle of the night and I'd get told, oh, so there's this event, Miss Abakiliki or something, right? And you'd get shoved in a very odd plane with sticky tape over some windows and stuff and land in a crappy place and go and host Miss Abakiliki. No disrespect to Abakiliki, right? Great place, your fufu is happening. But the truth is, I learned from sitting in front of large numbers of people that every time that people are collected in a body, there is a common denominator. And every good host will know this. The common denominator is how you break through to people. It's what you base your jokes on, which eases up the crowd and makes them relax. The reason people go to podcasts is because radio is like firing. How many of you know anything about firearms here? Guns. Worry boys, put your hands up right now before I start calling you out. Anyway, so a shotgun releases pellets in a wide spray. In short distances, it can do terrible damage to a target. But the farther away the target gets, the less powerful it is. Not to say that the pellets are not going to make impact. They're just not going to do that much damage. A pistol, on the other hand, fires one slug. It travels a lot faster because it has a definite trajectory. All of the gunpowder inside of the cartridge is decided to push that one thing in one direction. That's the same thing happening to podcasts versus radio. Radio is your shotgun. Over short distances, it's incredibly powerful. As long as we're all Nigerians, Pidgin speakers, Yoruba speakers, Igbo speakers, Hausa speakers, football lovers, lovers of Nigerian music, rock music lovers, fans of Young Jeezy, interested in Nicki Minaj's butt, whatever. Radio is going to do, I caught you laughing, fam. Radio is going to do a fantastic job of aggregating that. Podcast, on the other hand, is the single bullet that emerges from the barrel. It is for people who know that they don't fit. You don't listen to podcasts because you're trying to become a member of a new demographic. You listen to podcasts because you don't fit into the current demographic that you live in. Now, a lot of people are making podcasts the same way that most of us made radio in the 1990s and the early 2000s. We're making it for the mass market. And that's great. It aids the numbers. But it really does a terrible thing to the people who are hoping to get what they want on the back end. Pulse has a podcast for erotica. Now, most of you, when Osagie says erotica, you all go, like you don't know what that is. If I picked up your phone right now, went to your browser and entered www.p.
Incognito tabs. You've never heard of that?
Homegirl, gotta love you, man.
I'm helping you guys out. Since, you don't want to talk. You are shy.
No, but see, more and more people are looking to connect in ways that they couldn't before. Dami, the most popular radio shows you have on the beat, what is the one thing they have in common?
Music.
And?
Well, sometimes they like us OAPs, but they really just...
If you toot your horn one more time, I promise this will be Judgment Day, really. In my time on radio, one of the most popular things for people to do was to call in when the lines were open. People love to hear the sound of their voice. They love it so much that they'll turn the radio up, even when you scream, turn down your volume before you call. And then you start hearing that sound that sounds like this. You know? Those guys are not calling in because they've got a lot of airtime. Most of them are very low income earners. They call in because they want to connect. That's the second reason why podcasts are growing. Because you can log into iTunes, or you can go to SoundCloud, or you can log into any one of your favorite, if you're a Castbox user, whatever your aggregator is. You can go there, and you don't even have to know the podcast name. You can essentially ask podcasts about X or Y, and you're going to get a whole fleet of options. People are looking for things that fit the way they feel. And in the 21st century, when your cell phone is more about what you do specifically than what is in vogue, so are your entertainment and broadcasting options. Fact number 3.
So let me ask you this. Do you think podcasts can replace radio?
Absolutely.
Absolutely what?
Yes.
Oh, okay. I thought there was still more to it.
I think it's inevitable. It's inevitable. Was that a setup question? Like?
No, it was not a setup. They actually told me to ask this. I feel like I've been set up.
Oh, really?
But if you want to feel like you've been set up.
No, but look at it this way, right? H.G. Wells, the science fiction author, right? In the 1930s, he read War of the Worlds, which coincidentally was remade as a movie and was the crappiest sci-fi movie ever.
That's a lie.
You have horrible taste, my friend. Horrible. Anyway, War of the Worlds, while it was read on radio in Chicago, actually caused a riot. Anyone know about this? It caused a riot. People thought that there was an actual alien invasion taking place, and they got up and they packed up their stuff and they skedaddled. The government later calmed everyone down, but they called H.G. Wells aside and they warned him. Now, most people know this as a standalone thing, but they don't know the subsequent parts of the story. You can literally track the growth of FM radio, literally, in the continental United States from the day that H.G. Wells issued that broadcast to today. Literally. This is, if you've got a cell phone, please feel free to do your own research. But you literally saw a spike from about 16 to 25% listenership that went as high as 72% through the Second World War and lasted all the way past until the end of the reign of the Beatles. Which, of course, is when music really just took a nosedive.
What would you, considering the fact that people use data to listen to your podcast, what would you advise as the duration for your recordings?
Interestingly, we've only had one person complain, tweet at us to say, hey man, the podcast is too long, I use too much data to listen to the podcast. But a few weeks later, the person was tweeting about what he listened to in the 61st minute or something. So essentially, we are not going to reduce the hours. Generally, Loose Talk, because it's very casual, we spend about an hour and a half. An average episode of Loose Talk is an hour and a half. But let me tell you something about good stories, right? And great conversations. People don't mind. If you can spend all day on Instagram, Snapchat, where you download or you stream a lot of videos or YouTube, then I'm sure you can also listen to podcasts. So at the end of the day, for publishers, you have to just tell great stories. If you tell great stories, people listen. There's a podcast a rapper, Nori, does. It's 3 hours. I listen to everything, and I know people who listen to it. So like I said, if you have a great conversation and great stories to tell, people would always listen. But it also depends on what kind of podcast you're creating. Like I said, Halftime, our sports podcast is just 15 minutes. The sound is 20 minutes. Republic of Bands is about 20 to 25 minutes. So it depends on the concept as well.
All right, we have a guy. Someone was standing there.
Okay, I wanted to ask, what is the best platform to host or like post your podcast? Is it SoundCloud, iTunes, and also keeping in mind how much data it will use, I guess, how fast it will be to stream it as well, and how easy it is to access it, especially in Nigeria. Most people don't want to download more apps that they don't already have. So, how do you guys do it?
Like I said in the presentation, you can upload your content on SoundCloud, it's the easiest, and connect it to iTunes. There are also platforms like WordPress and Libsyn. Are you listening?
Yeah.
Yes. There are also platforms like WordPress and Libsyn. They are easy to use. Now, the two most popular audio streaming platforms on your mobile device connected to the internet is probably SoundCloud and iTunes right now.
Okay, so my question is around monetization. So I was just curious. I wanted to know, before you took over My Africa, was it profitable? So what informed you acquiring My Africa?
Andre, you want to answer that? Should I answer that? Okay, well, essentially I should. Well, like I said, My Africa had sort of gone viral. I would say viral amongst everybody, but like within the podcast listeners community, My Africa had gone really viral, and it was so standardized and stable. It was used as in-flight in South Africa Airways. People were talking and resharing these stories. So we were just about launching. I remember I started Loose Talk independently before pulling it into Pulse, and we looked at, what's the biggest podcast out there right now? Oh, it's My Africa. Why don't we talk to these guys and acquire it and start to build on that? We already foresee the future, and Pulse, owned by Ringier, is like 199 years old since 1808, and the first thing they've always prided themselves about is being innovative, and that is why we got My Africa podcast.
All right, if I get you correctly, you said on podcasts you don't play songs, right?
You can play songs. You can put in musical compositions, musical recordings. You can, but you have to get a license or permission for it.
So how often do you on your podcast play songs?
We don't want songs.
Okay, considering the fact that an average listener wants more music and less talk, so how do you balance
That's
it?
the thing. The
How do
average
you-
listener is not coming to listen to a podcast.
Okay, so
With the spread of the internet in this era, why do you need to go to radio to listen to a song? You have Apple Music, you have Spotify, you have all these streaming apps. Why do you need to go to a Cool FM or a Beat FM to listen to songs? It doesn't make sense. Sorry, personally, it doesn't make sense. I have my own playlist and I enjoy my own songs. What podcasts are there for?
And also to add to that, right? If you think the average listener listens to music, then he will go to, or she will go to a platform where they play only music. So Spotify, iTunes, Pulse, not just wherever, you will go there to listen to music. But if you want to listen to conversations, right, niche content, maybe sports, lifestyle, fashion, business, news, politics, you would listen to your favorite podcast.
I think, let me also add to that, because contrary to what you people might believe, I actually do believe that radio is in a fade-out phase. Because if you think about it, this was how people were talking about newspapers a while back, and newspapers they're getting extinct, trust me. Because you see them being printed out, it's redundant now. Because if something happens at 4 p.m., only PM News carries it, and by 4 p.m. you might have even printed PM News anyways.
PM News closed down their printing.
So they're done?
Yes.
See what I was saying? But then let me get to you. Now, the thing about it is, If you're going to listen to something like Loose Talks, you already know that they're not playing music. You know what you're going to listen to. Something like Andre Blaze said, he said it's a direct thing. It's like a pistol shot. You know where you're going, you know what you want to hear. If you are going to listen to music, of course, you do make a valid point because the OAP is not going to play what you want to hear all the time. You understand? Which is why you flip radio stations, which is why technically most listeners are radio prostitutes, to be fair. So if you want to listen to music, if you don't have the availability of mixing your own music so that you can hear it in your car, in your house and stuff, that's when you end up going to radio to listen to it, and that's why talk annoys you. So for people who listen to talk radio, they don't really want to hear music. They want to have that conversation going. So you know what you're getting into when you're listening to podcasts, when you're listening to radio, and when you really just want to listen to music, basically.